Today in this video, we are going to explain the problems of deficient and excess demand. It is not essential that aggregate demand and the level of output are always in equilibrium at the level of full employment. It can, as always, above or below this line. In other words, it is not always essential that the existing volume of aggregate demand would always be equal to the aggregate demand required to reach the level of full employment. If this equilibrium which creates the problems of excess demand or deficient demand in the economy. Now let us try to understand the excess demand. If aggregate demand increases beyond the level of full employment, it does not raise the level of output and employment in the economy. Hence, there is practically no increase in real income. It merely increases monetary income. In this situation, increase in demand means only an increase in money expenditure without any corresponding increase in employment and output. This is called the situation of excess demand. When actual aggregate demand becomes higher than the amount of aggregate demand required for full employment, it is called excess demand situation. That is, current aggregate demand AD is greater than aggregate demand at the level of full employment, that is ADF. Excess demand occurs when the actual aggregate demand AD is greater than the aggregate demand required for full employment, that is ADF. The extent to which actual aggregate demand becomes higher than the aggregate demand required for full employment, referred as inflationary gap. Greater the inflationary gap, larger the size of excess demand. Inflationary gap thus measures the size of excess demand. It is evident from this diagram. In order to achieve full employment, we require only EQF, that is EM level of aggregate demand. But our current aggregate demand has reached the level of FM. Thus, aggregate demand has increased to the tune of EF over and above the level what was needed. It is this surplus demand which is termed as excess demand. This excess or surplus demand gives rise to price inflation. Hence is called inflationary gap. It is evident from the figure that new aggregate demand curve, that is AD, meets the 45-degree line at E1. This brings equilibrium at E1 point. So this portion beyond M to this equilibrium, let us see. If this one we give the name of N, then Mn is the increase in money income, not the real income. Thus, in this diagram, full employment level of output is OM. The aggregate demand required for full employment level is EM. Actual aggregate demand is FM. Therefore, inflationary gap is FM minus EM is equal to EF. EF is the inflationary gap. The point of this equilibrium E1 between aggregate demand and 45-degree line, that is income line, remains rightward to the full employment level equilibrium. The full employment level equilibrium is E1, E, and the actual equilibrium occurs at E1. What are the reasons of excess demand? Increase in money supply due to deficit financing, increase in the government demand for goods and services, increase in consumption demand as a result of rise in propensity to consume, increase in disposable income and consumption demand as a consequence of reduction in taxes, increase in demand due to increase in credit facilities, increase in investment demand, and increase in export demand. These can be the causes of excess demand. Now let us see the deficient demand. When the equilibrium between aggregate demand and 45-degree line, that is income line, takes place at a less than full employment, that is the full employment level, but it occurs at the less than full employment level, is termed as underemployment equilibrium. This is underemployment equilibrium. In this situation, some of the factors, that is resources, remain unemployed. Now the question arises that why does this happen? It happens when the current aggregate demand falls short of the volume of aggregate demand required to reach the level of full employment. It is because of this deficiency of aggregate demand that we are not able to reach the level of full employment. Hence, it is termed as deficient demand. Thus, deficient demand refers to the situation when actual aggregate demand, that is AD, falls short of the aggregate demand required for the level of full employment, that is ADF. In other words, we can say deficient demand occurs when the actual aggregate demand AD is smaller than the aggregate demand required for full employment level, that is ADF. The problem of deficient demand depends primarily on deflationary gap, this gap, deflationary gap. The extent to which actual aggregate demand falls short of aggregate demand required for full employment is termed as deflationary gap. This is deflationary gap. Greater the deflationary gap, larger the size of deficient demand. If AD less than ADF, the measurement of deficient demand or aggregate demand is ADF minus AD. Now let us see from the figure. In the figure, x-axis we have measured the level of employment, output and income, and y-axis we have measured aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Now, OQF is the full employment level of output and income. When the aggregate demand curve is AD intersects the 45-degree line at point E, E is the point of equilibrium. It indicates that aggregate demand is EQF, which is just equal to the aggregate demand required for full employment level of output, that is OQF. Hence, point E represents full employment equilibrium. This point is the full employment equilibrium. Suppose aggregate demand curve becomes ADF or AD1. It is clear from the figure that we require EQF, aggregate demand, to reach the level of full employment. But our actual aggregate demand is only equivalent to LQF. When economy is producing OQF, aggregate demand is LQF. But we need EQF. This level of aggregate demand corresponds to point L on the aggregate demand curve, and at this point aggregate demand curve lies lower than the 45-degree line. Thus, actual aggregate demand falls short to the tune of EL, that is EQF minus LQF, to the aggregate demand required for full employment. Hence, it is the case of deficient demand. When aggregate demand falls short to the full employment level of output, it gives rise to the situation of deflation in the economy. So from this diagram, we can summarize. Full employment level is OQF. The aggregate demand required for full employment is EQF. Actual aggregate demand is LQF. Deflationary gap is EQF minus LQF is equal to EL. The point of underemployment equilibrium is E1. The point of full employment equilibrium is point E. Therefore, this is the deflationary gap or deficient aggregate demand. Let us find out the reasons for deficient demand. Decrease in total supply of money in the country, either because of decrease in supply of currency by the government or because of reduction in credit creation by the commercial banks. Next, reduction in public expenditure or government purchases of goods and services. Next, decrease in consumption demand as a consequence of increase in propensity to save or decrease in propensity to consume. Decrease in disposable income and consumption demand as a result of increase in taxes. Decrease in investment demand due to increase in bank rate and decline in export demand. These can be the possible reasons of deficient demand. The causes already we have said: excess demand, rise in propensity to consume, reduction in taxes, increase in government expenditure, increase in investment, fall in imports, rise in exports, and deficit financing. Reasons for deficient demand: increase in propensity to save, increase in taxes, decrease in government expenditure, decrease in investment demand, fall in exports, rise in imports. Measures to correct excess and deficient demand. First, change in government spending. Now, during the excess demand situation, the government will reduce its spending on goods and services. And during the deficient demand, the government will increase its spendings. During excess demand, government will increase the tax, and during deficient demand, government will reduce the tax. Change in money supply or availability of credit. Now, availability of credit, the credit will be made cheaper during the deficient demand, and during the excess demand, credit will be made costlier. Now, these are the RBI can control this both the situations by applying its instruments: bank rate, open market operations, cash reserve ratio, statutory liquidity ratio, repo rate and reverse repo rate, qualitative instruments such as margin rate requirement, moral suasion, selective credit control measures. That's all. Thank you.